So, Bradley was actually born almost 3 months early, and when he was a couple weeks old, he was diagnosed with a congenital heart defect. And just having both of those things at the same time was really bad. So he needed a surgery when he was, way too small to have it. He
Mm.
needed to be like um, 15 pounds to have the surgery, and he was not even 2 pounds. So a lot of kids that go through stuff that he had, like he was on ventilators a lot, he's had a lot going on with his mouth, and just a lot of really scary things happening, develop a sensory disorder called oral aversion. And there's different degrees of it, but Bradley was so severe, like he literally could not eat. I couldn't like even touch him like on his cheeks, or he would just throw up like right away. He was in the hospital the first time for 165 days after he was born, and then he was kind of in and out after that until he turned one.
Okay.
Because he was having like surgeries, he was throwing up a lot, he was having a lot of
Mm.
problems. I mean, there's lots of things that can cause oral aversion, but anyway, it was just there were so many things going on. It was hard to even tease it all out. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's a lot of people think, well, just don't feed him and he'll get hungry and he'll eat. And that's just not the way that oral aversion works. He really couldn't handle like any stimulation to his mouth. He never got hungry. He never got thirsty.
Mhm.
He still doesn't really get hungry or thirsty very much. It's
Mm.
just now even starting to come back on after all this time and treatment and everything. So
Okay.
anyway, so he had to be fed through a feeding tube, or he would have starved to death. So
Right.
he was fed through his feeding tube till he was almost 4. There's different kinds of feeding tubes. When he was really little, before he was too big to be having, or too little, I mean, to be having surgeries, he had what's called an NG tube, which actually goes like through your nose and down
Mhm.
through your esophagus and into the stomach.
Yeah.
But that's obviously not the best thing to be doing long term. So if that was someone who was going to have a feeding tube for a very short time, that's what they would do to avoid surgery. If it's clear that an adult or a child's going to need one for a long time, they'll actually like surgically place a tube that goes like right through the stomach. They like make a hole called a stoma and
Mhm.
put this tube in there with like a little button on the outside that you connect like what's called an extension tube to it, and it actually goes like right into the stomach organ. So whatever you're feeding goes right in there, and then just goes on the rest of the way. So yeah, it is G tube. It's called a G tube
Mhm.
that gets placed into the stomach, and he had been throwing up really, really bad until then. And everybody just thought, like, well, once the NG tube is out, like, they were thinking that must be like, because you have something like literally going through the back of your throat and everything, like maybe that's gagging him and it's
Yeah.
causing the vomiting. So I also thought, like, oh, once he finally gets the G tube, it'll be so great. He's going to stop all this throwing up because it had been really, really bad. Anyway, obviously, I'm sure you can guess, he did not stop throwing up after he got the surgery. And
Mhm.
I just had no idea. I mean, I went to doctor after doctor. I went to all these GIs. I went to dietitians, and no one. They did so many tests on his gut motility and things like that. They couldn't find anything wrong. They had him on all kinds of medications, just motility medications and reflux medications and nausea medications. It just didn't matter. It's like no matter what we did, he just threw up um, all the time. And
Yeah. That had to be so hard to watch as a mom.
yeah, I mean, he was so nauseated um,
Mm.
that he didn't play with any toys or anything. I mean, when he was like well over a year old, he could barely even like hold his head up, and he definitely couldn't sit or anything because he just didn't even like move or do anything because he was just like totally paralyzed by
Mm.
nausea. And
Mm.
um, after they'd done every test, and I had seen so many different medical professionals, they kind of just threw their hands in the air and were like, this is just kind of what happens when people have feeding tubes. They just throw up a lot. We really don't know why.
Mm.
And we just have to hope that he grows out of it. And, maybe to a doctor, and I love his doctors, uh, that might be easy to say though when a mom has to just go back home and you don't have to think about it anymore. But to just take your baby home, like, okay, I guess we'll just throw up for years and years. And I mean,
Mhm.
I'm talking it on a good day, it was 10 times a day, and on other days it was even worse. Yeah,
Right.
he was like 14 months old. He weighed 12 pounds because
Wow.
he went like probably I would say a good 6 months without even gaining a single ounce. Like he always
Wow.
weighed, it was 12 pounds 6 ounces, I believe, is what it was. Just he had like a nurse that came by weekly to weigh him because of all of his medical issues and everything. And I just remember he always weighed the same after spending 7 days where, I mean, trying to feed him literally consumed our lives. We couldn't really go anywhere because I was too scared, like, oh, if he throws up in the car and he chokes, or whatever, and I can't help him.
Mm.
And plus, how do you take a kid anywhere anyway? That's just projectile vomiting everywhere. So we were just totally isolated, totally trapped at home. Had what I felt like done the right thing, gone to all the doctors and dietitians, and I'm not in any way speaking bad of the medical profession. I mean, they saved his life through some really, really terrible things, but they didn't have answers for this. So I finally just got on the computer and Googled reflux and vomiting in tube-fed babies help. I was just so desperate.
Yeah.
Molly, you know a little bit about the story anyway, since we've talked a little bit in the past. But
Yeah.
actually, before I went to the Google, I skipped a part. There was, I don't know what it was about this one day, but it was like my day that I could not handle this happening anymore. And I had a baby bottle that I was getting ready to add to Bradley's feeding pump. It's like a pump that is slowly um, pushes the formula into his stomach, which was being run at like 3 ounces an hour. I mean, like that was barely even feeding him anything, and he was still throwing it up all the time. And I was walking toward him, and he just like puked all over himself and all over the couch, and it was just like I just really hit this like I can't take this anymore. I can't watch my child suffer anymore. And I just wanted him to have relief. I felt like, I mean, you normally feel this drive to feed your child, but every time I did it, it made him very sick. And it was just the most horrible thing. And I had that baby bottle in my hand, and I was just so angry. I mean, I had been like looking on Facebook at all my friends who were taking all their kids, even like friends who were next to us in the NICU and had been through, more than their fair share of problems too. Out taking their kids swimming and like, kind of moving on with their lives while I was sitting at home with a 12-pound 1-year-old who just threw up all the time. And I was just so angry that like nothing would ever get better. So I threw the bottle across the apartment because I was just so angry, and it totally crashed into a window, which was made for a great phone call to my landlord. Fortunately, not fortunately, but I mean, he had his wife went through a lot of medical issues and stuff. So he was very understanding. I just had to call him and say, "You won't believe what I did today, and I'm so sorry." He came over and fixed the window, but it was like, I don't know. It was just my moment where it's like my energies for coping with this was just completely gone. So I got on the computer and I Googled that, and I found this old blog that wasn't even like kept up anymore that a mom had written, and I could tell it was like written kind of when blogs were just a new thing. It was like in a really old format and all that. And she was talking about how her daughter threw up really bad too, and she belonged to what was at the time a kind of small community of people who were rejecting the formulas that they make for feeding tubes. So to clarify what I'm talking about, there's the stuff called enteral formula. It's not the same as infant formula. It's specifically made for tube feeding.
Okay.
So it's kind of crazy because I'm really like crunchy. I check like ingredients on everything, and I mean, it had been for a few years before I even got pregnant, and I had never looked at the ingredients on that enteral formula. And I was reading this blog, and this mom was talking about how it's just ingredients that would be hard for anyone to digest eating in that quantity. And they were instead taking like a Vitamix blender or a Blendtec, like a high powered blender like that, and just taking food like their kids would be eating if they ate by mouth and blending it up in the blender to puree it really fine so it could go through the tube. And she talked about her daughter's story about how she'd been throwing up so badly on this enteral formula, and she started to just blend her up regular food, and she stopped throwing up. And I just was like, I mean, I was just totally shocked that like no one had even told me this was an option. I had no idea. I had just been told if you have a feeding tube, this is what you have to feed. And I looked at the ingredients of what I was feeding him, and so the formulas they make for tube feeding, literally all the carbohydrates are from sugar, and all the fats are from oils, and like some of the worst oils too. And then they have like something like, depending on the formula, there's like sometimes they have whey protein or some kind of protein powder. and synthetic vitamins and minerals. And this is what my child was expected to live off of for years. And a lot of children with feeding tubes, Bradley, we knew eventually he would eat by mouth after a lot of therapy, but there's a lot of children that they're going to have a feeding tube their entire life. So now when I look back on it, of course, knowing what I know now, I'm like, why did I never think about, like, can you imagine a child like going their entire life and they've never eaten a vegetable or anything or a grain or anything, to have only ever consumed sugar, oil, protein powder, and a synthetic vitamin. And
Yeah.
I guess
Yeah.
once I just looked at that ingredient list, I just felt so like, I can't believe I never checked this stuff. I just told it was really good and just kind of accepted that. I used to have a lot of problems like chronic pain and things like that, and eating a plant-based diet had like 95% resolved all of that. And I was actually also really excited because the whole time I was pregnant, I just really planned on, I'm going to feed my child the right way from the way I want. I don't say right way, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Just a
Yeah.
healthy, natural diet from the start, and I
Yeah.
was so excited about that. And then when he had a feeding tube and I had that taken away, it was a really big deal. I really grieved for that. So it just
Yeah.
hit me like I can still feed him all these foods that I wanted to. They'll just be going through his feeding tube instead. So,
Yes.
um,
Yeah. What a
obviously,
revelation, right?
yeah. Um, so I ran out of the store. I started off just with like some baby food because I didn't have a Vitamix or anything like that to do that, and I fed it to him, and he didn't throw up. And it was honestly the first time in like probably 8 months that I had fed him without causing him to throw up. And so some friends did a fundraiser for me and got a Vitamix right away. And I started him on a plant-based diet, and I mean, he just did great from day one. I mean, he does have some GI problems. He's got a lot of dietary restrictions, so it took some figuring out. But he immediately started to grow. He was happy and laughing and started playing with toys. Um, it was just really, I'll never be able to put into words what it was like to see such a transformation after watching my child suffer for so long,
Mm.
every day. And then I just get them on something as simple as real food. Um, and it's something that a group of moms and I are really fighting for right now. A lot of people in the medical profession are against feeding tube fed kids this way. And I don't want to get into too much detail as to why or whatever, but there's just some companies out there that make enteral formula that are doing a lot of really poorly done research to kind of
Sway
give an
things.
incorrect. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. I'll just leave it
Yeah.
at that. But we're
Yeah.
working really hard to get that changed. And because I have seen, I lead an online group right now of over 10,000 moms that feed their children this way. And I mean, I have literally just seen like thousands of children go from being like Bradley, just very sick. I've seen kids that were in the hospital like every 3 to 4 weeks because every time they got a cold or any little thing, they'd end up in the hospital and very, very sick. And then they get on, a diet of pureed food, and they're not even in the hospital at all. Like I've
Mm.
seen like people celebrating 1 year anniversaries of no hospitalizations of kids that were in the hospital 10 or more times a year when they were on these enteral formulas. So after all that was going so great, then Bradley started doing really well in feeding therapy. Um, and I had fought really hard to feed him pureed food through his tube, and I thought I'd won that battle with his team and all that.
Yeah.
Then when it came time for him to eat by mouth, I was told that kids with oral aversion, the way they have to learn to eat is by eating like ice cream and pudding and
Mm.
drink these formulas that I had just fought so hard to get him off.
Yeah.
And I was like, what? So I had this whole battle all over again. I basically just asked them, like, do you have any research to show me that this is what kids with oral aversion have to have, or they just can't get off their feeding tube? And they just kind of looked at me like, what? I
That's
was
a
like, is this
no,
just because it's
obviously.
always been this way, or has anybody ever actually
Right.
checked? Have you ever tried another way? And they acted like they didn't even know, like I just grown a second head or something. Like, what are you talking about? So
Mm.
I just told her, like, I've worked so hard to feed him all this nutritious food through his feeding tube, and he has just done, this has been like 2 years later. He has just done amazing. He's growing really well, and is catching up developmentally and all this. And I just can't take that away from him and have him going back to just living off sugar,
The same
basically for
stuff,
most of
just in
his
a
diet.
different
Yeah, I
way.
just,
Yeah.
plus
Yeah.
I'm like, that obviously made him throw up very badly. So how is that going to make him encourage him to eat by mouth? So It was definitely a battle. I had to do a lot of calls to find a feeding therapist that was willing to work with me on this. And I've met a lot of parents going through the same thing where they like feeding therapists won't even work with you or help you if
Mm.
you were not willing to do it this particular way. But I fortunately I live in Chicago, so there's a lot of options available for me. So I did find a place in the loop that, they weren't necessarily like, yeah, feed him with healthy food, but they're willing to at least try it and just see what was happening, and he weaned off of it. Took about a year, but he did wean off of his feeding tube without any desserts, without anything like that. He eats whole grains. I mean, he eats plant based. He doesn't really. I don't think he even really knows a lot about all the special treats and stuff other than like parties or birthdays or special things like that. And um, it's really been an example to a lot of other people that if you just keep trying, if you just keep working at it, I didn't just put a plant based meal in front of him and he gobbled it all down. It was, maybe one little bite here and one little bite there. But now, I mean, he eats one of the widest variety of healthy foods of any kid I know, and he has this terrible feeding disorder that, and so I always just try to tell moms and dads too, of course, just don't give your kid a meal, and if it's like, well, they didn't like it, then just go off and get them something else and give up on it. You just have to keep giving it and let them play with it with their hands and let them get very familiar with it, and eventually they're going to be okay with putting it in their mouth, and maybe they'll spit it back out because it's just a new flavor to them, but give it to them again next time, and eventually they're going to swallow it and they're going to eat it. And it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of patience, but it's worth it in the end. And I'm just so proud of Bradley for all the hard work he's done. And he still has to eat a lot of purees, but he's eating like some softer foods now. But we have been eating off the meal plans for, I think it was a year in February, I believe. But anyway, I know it's for sure been over a year. And he just had some sloppy joes this last week, and I posted about it in the group. He totally gobbled those down.
Oh man, that's so awesome. So can you give me an example of when you were pureeing foods like in the Vitamix and doing those through the feeding tube? Can you give some examples of like some foods that you would make that worked really well at that point?
I mean, honestly, I tell people like you'd be really surprised what I've managed to get to this feeding tube. A Vitamix is so powerful that I have fed him like bean burritos, pancakes. I mean, a lot of times I think people think that you have to like be real choosy about what foods you use or whatever. And the only thing I've ever found to be a problem is raspberries and blackberries because they have those kind of bigger seeds, and those. And one time I did blend up some cantaloupe seeds and totally destroyed his. And I mean, literally destroyed his feeding tube. We had to like throw it away and get a new one and put it in. But other than that, I mean, yeah, like, some oatmeal and some fruit for breakfast. I would just blend that up, or a lot of times I would use that Engine 2 brand of cereal because it just has kind of a lot of calories in a small volume, which is bad for me, but great for him. And I would blend that up with like some almond milk or something. And really just, I mean, I tell parents like, a peanut butter sandwich and some vegetables. I mean, that's what you would give an orally fed kid. I mean, that's no dietitian would be freaking out over, a kid having some soy milk and a peanut butter sandwich and some carrots for lunch. So just, to try to think of it in terms of meals like that. But yeah, I mean, just kind of whatever the food you normally eat, so.
And so is there like a good ratio though? Because you have to then like put the food in there with some liquids, right, to make it
right, make it go.
To put in the tube. So did you just like add water to those things until it was the right consistency?
Usually I like to blend with like as little liquid as possible because it can kind of, especially if you're blending up to like sit it in the refrigerator and have it later, it can kind of thicken. I mean, think if you have like a smoothie and you put in the fridge and you come back and it's kind of thick after it's been sitting for a little while, and then just to stir in a little water right before serving it or whatever. So really, I would just take like some almond milk or soy milk or something like that. It is kind of one of those things that's more of an art than a science in some ways. You just kind of get a feel for like after a while you just start putting things in the Vitamix and you just kind of know like how much liquid to add.
Right.
There's definitely a learning curve there, but I mean overall it really wasn't this big complicated really hard thing. A lot of parents are told that it's just, oh my gosh, it's so hard to make sure everything's just right, and it's really not. again, like, you're certainly going to make some errors at the very beginning, maybe accidentally make the meal way too much. But I mean, I've made some really, really thick blends and pushed it right through. It's really about making sure there's not particles that can gather up and clump into the tube.
Mm.
As long as it's nice and smooth, even if it's really thick, it's going to go through. Um,
Okay. And I'm
so
sure that there's, I mean, people who would be doing this would be familiar with that because I'm sure that they would be educated about how to use a feeding tube. And so I'm sure
right,
there's
right. I mean,
guidelines. Yeah.
yeah, you can put it through I've seen people use, and I have myself use feeding pumps
Mhm.
for their blended diets. I've seen people that you can do it with syringe and just kind of push it in. There's different reasons that you would do different ways, but
Yeah.
I've seen every way that you can feed through a feeding tube work with blended food.
That's so awesome.
So
So then when the feeding tube came out and when Bradley no longer had that and you started doing some foods orally, what were like the foods in the beginning that you were giving him that he took to?
I really started with like vegetables a lot just because I know kids have a hard time eating those. So I figured kind of take advantage of the fact that he had a tube for the main parts of his meals. So just like, pureed carrots, pureed green beans were, he didn't really like green beans at first, but he eventually, I put like some garlic and things like that. I'm gonna make them a little bit tasty. I also tell people like put like seasoning in your kids' foods. Like don't
That's
I think
awesome.
people think when their kids first eating, they give like really bland foods, and I don't, and then we wonder why when they're 3 they only eat bland food. I kind of from
Mm.
the very beginning seasoned his food, so that would be normal to have like flavor going along with it, and I think that
People
that
do
will.
that all over the world, by the way. Like that is not uncommon. Like you see little kids in Malaysia, there is no like kids menu. Like they're going to eat the
Yeah,
same stuff that their parents eat. So I'm with you on that.
yeah. That's I tell people don't give your kids don't like cater to your kids like this. If they only eat these first few foods or whatever, just give them like regular food. And
Yeah.
if I can do that from a child who doesn't experience hunger and doesn't experience thirst, to allow their hunger to drive them to eat these foods, just be patient with it. Like keep offering, keep offering. A lot of it is just familiarity. They just have to try food several times to kind of feel safe with that food,
Yeah.
and then they'll eat it. But yeah, so I guess I don't really want to trap people into like, well, these foods work better or these foods. It's kind of like whatever you're eating in your home. So if you're
It's
eating
like
these plans,
whole
just
plant
enjoy it.
foods, basically.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
know, beans. And obviously like for bread and things, I had to puree them. I still do. He can do like whole grain noodles and things like that. But
Mhm. Mhm.
like when we did sloppy joes, I was using some whole grain buns, so I just pureed that with some of the sloppy joe stuff. But I guess I mean that is my advice: is just don't think of it as like what are some good first foods. It's more like what do you eat in your home, then just feed your
Mhm.
child that.
So tell me about Bradley now.
Well, he just started walking, so he had a stroke actually when he
Uh,
was in the hospital, and that's been a lot of reasons for his physical delays. So he's walked with a walker since last summer. Christmas Day, actually, he took his first steps without his walker. It was just like the best Christmas gift ever. But he's doing great. I mean, his medical team is just absolutely amazed with how healthy he is. He's supposed to see the cardiologist. He's had open heart surgeries and things like that. Not anything recently, but his heart is just in fantastic shape. Everything is, I mean, his prognosis is just great. So, and I know diet, was not the only part of that. Of course, getting the right medical treatment, things like that was important too. But I know that's played a very big component in that. It's just having all this great nutrition so his body can function, as
and
well as
grow
possible.
too.
Yeah, I mean, he's growing great.
Well, that's so awesome. And I know, and also, the other thing is, yes, good nutrition and a good medical team, but also you're an amazing mom,
Oh, thanks.
and everything that you have done for him and I mean, you think that, of course, you're the mom, you got to take care of your kid, but I mean, you've been really patient and you've tried so many things. And so it's a testimony to you too. It's so good that we're putting this out there because I mean, I'm sure that there's so many people who were in your shoes before you found out about this and before you knew, like,
Yeah,
really put it together that formula wasn't doing him any bit of good. And
yeah,
yet it's what is prescribed. And that's kind of the only path if you're talking to your doctors. And so I think it's so
right.
important to get your message out there that there is another way.
I really think the tube fed community, a lot of changes are going to happen over the next year or two that we've been working really hard at. So
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I think there's a bigger acceptance of the plant-based diet as a whole, and so with that, I think that's going to help set up success, like a change of thinking in that as well, because I think there are more people who are following a plant-based diet. And so
Right.
with that, parents who have their kids who do need to be on feeding tubes are going to be searching for something else, just like you did. And so
Right.
I think it's great to have to be a resource for people. And I'm just so glad that Bradley is doing well and he has come so far. I mean, just the pictures that you posted, like he's just come so very far, and it must make you just unbelievably joyful.
Oh yeah. We went to the park for the first time where he got to finally run around and play, and I was just totally bawling the whole time. And people were probably looking at me like, "What in the world?" But you just
they have no idea.
And like climb up these steps and go down a slide all by himself was just. I mean, he's just really, really doing amazing, and I'm really proud of him. He's worked really hard.
Yeah.
Hey, we're talking about you. I think a lot of parents worry about their kids being plant-based. Like, are they going to get everything that they need? And, I guess I can't sit here and spout off a bunch of studies or anything like that, but Bradley has just done really, really well in spite of his medical issues and everything. I really personally don't think that there's anything to fear with having your kids just eat plant-based. So,
yeah, well, I've never eaten meat in my entire life, and I'm just fine.
yeah, neither do I, right?
Never had meat. So, I think, yes, kids can definitely, absolutely thrive this way and do so much better,
Yeah,
do so much better. So, that's awesome. Well, can you take out your headphones so I can say goodbye to him? Let's see. I guess I'll have to unplug him. There we go. Hi, Bradley.
Hi.
Hi.
You want to say hi? Yeah? You can wave here. We'll wave together. Hey.
It's nice to see you and spend time with you and your mama.
Yeah, say hi to everybody. People are going to be watching this and can see you. Can you look?
Hi, Bradley. Oh, so sweet and so good. Well, thanks for sharing your story, and I'm going to be glad to have it up. And I appreciate your time and just spreading the good word and just all the continued success for the two of you. And Bradley, you keep up the good work, buddy.
Yeah. Good job. Well, now he's being shy and upset. So
I understand.
Sorry. Well, thanks so much, Mom.
Yep. Have an awesome night. Thanks,
All right.
Leslie.
Bye.
Bye.